So we already knew that you were terrible at GitHub, Seth. We already knew that. I just want to point out that I stole this hat from Tyler. I legit stole this hat. He says he has 200 more, which is great because I'm not giving it back. More. Also, I'm standing on a box. I'm standing on a box because
the guy
he's so
from
much
the control room came out and
taller
was like,
than me.
We should put this box in here.
Yeah,
we
so
should make sure
so you're welcome for that. Yeah. Let's get into this. You don't have to squat now. We're all good. We're going to talk about Jenkins. Jenkins has been around for what, like 10 years? So like...
I've been in the project for a little over 8 or 9 years, maybe.
Okay.
And it existed a little bit before then. The creator, who's now my boss at CloudBees, Kosuke Kawaguchi, created it at Sun Microsystems in 2006. And any sentence with Sun Microsystems is already a pretty old-timey thing to say at this point.
Right.
So it's been around for a while.
So it's old-timey. Like, so tell me why we should all care about this now.
So one of the cool things about working on a project for this long, I think I've worked for 4 different companies now, and at each company I've brought Jenkins into that into that organization, with the exception of CloudBees, which does sort of enterprise Jenkins stuff. And the cool thing about working on a project for that long is it's become very, very well known, very well adopted. It's really actually funny to be in a Microsoft studio talking about a Jenkins project on my Linux laptop with Microsoft logos all over the place. Like, the world has changed dramatically since the project started, which is both really promising, but it's also really good for us because we've been able to help drive some of that change in the software industry. And what is really powerful about Jenkins is it's an automation server, sort of at its most basic level. It helps with automation, right? In the beginning, that really was continuous integration. It's not dim out here. So continuous integration was sort of where Jenkins's bread and butter was. And as the industry moved on, like Jez Humboldt and a few other people started talking a lot about continuous delivery. The folks from IMVU started talking about continuous deployment even. And Jenkins has been able to adapt and grow with that because A, it's open source, and B, there's a lot of contributors that are bringing different plugins and integrations to Jenkins that make it sort of this like infinitely pluggable piece of automation technology that just about any organization can take and just drop into their existing infrastructure and make it work for them.
Right. We live in like a continuous everything world right now, which is great, I think.
And Jenkins helps with the continuous part.
Yeah.
But it's something that, you know, as we've grown, the things that we did, I would say in 2006, aren't necessarily the things that we need in 2017.
Sure.
And so over the past couple of years, there's been a few sort of major leaps forward in what we do in the Jenkins project and how people use Jenkins. That is something that's for me, part of my day job is actually telling people like, no, Jenkins is different now. There's a lot new stuff there, a lot more new stuff rather, that is really, really interesting, really, really easy to use, and really, you know, nice to look at.
We just bonded. I do that at Microsoft too now. Yeah.
It was weird for me because when I first started with the project, I was, Kosuke would sometimes refer to me as the cheerleader.
Yeah.
Like my entry into the project for a long, long time was I would write stuff on blogs, I would write some documentation, I would go speak about it at events, because Jenkins underneath all the covers was Java, and for me, you know, as a Python and Ruby developer, I found Java
gross? What?
I wasn't going to say gross, but I was thinking it. It's a little gross. I don't particularly like Java. Java 8, however, is actually quite nice. They've changed a lot in Java land. But so I came into this open source project that I really enjoyed using, like, what can I do?
Yes.
And the documentation stuff came along, some of the outreach type stuff came along, and the infrastructure stuff started to be an avenue that I started to contribute to the Jenkins project. When you have, in ye olden days before GitHub was around and sort of making everything awesome for people, people had to run servers to run their open source projects. It was
I don't even remember what life was like before GitHub.
It was
people clicking stones together, crazy.
That's about what it was.
Yeah.
It was, you took some SourceForge and some CVS and you tried to make things work. And so we had a lot of developers in the Jenkins project, but no one wanted to run the servers. Like no one wanted to run the infrastructure to make the project go. And so that's actually how I really started to get deeply embedded in the project, was someone had to keep the lights on, and I'm a gullible idiot, and I said, I'll do that. And so that's what I do with my colleague Olivier. We work on a lot of the infrastructure, which is what brings me to Microsoft and Azure.
Cool. Well, let's get into that.
Sure.
I know that you're going to not demo things, but let's talk through this.
Right. So to sort of step back a little bit and so before I get to the infrastructure stuff, let's talk about Jenkins pipeline, which for me was one of the big leaps that we've made over the last couple years. In the old stone clapping together world of Jenkins, the way that people would construct their automation is they would go through this WYSIWYG editor and they would create a job configuration. And if you had something like my normal project, I've got to build it, I've got to test it, and then I've got to release it or deploy it somewhere.
Right.
Like most projects fit into that sort of build, test, deploy pipeline. So what people used to do is you would create a build job, you would create a test job, you'd create a deploy job, and you'd chain those together. And it was sort of, you could do it, and a lot of people did, but it wasn't very clear to people, users coming into the Jenkins interface, what was actually wired together, how
Right.
everything was configured. And so sometime before we released Jenkins 2 last year, a number of people within the project started working on this thing that we called pipeline. And Jenkins pipeline is sort of, I would say it's not like jobs in that the goal is to model your entire continuous delivery process, right? So instead of just doing the build stuff over here and doing the test stuff over here and the deploy stuff, let's put that all together because that's how we think about our software development lifecycle, right? So that was part of it. And then this sort of like X as code movement was also a big influence. Like I started using Puppet probably 5 or 6 years ago, and about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to get sick of the infrastructure as code sort of rhetoric. But with Jenkins, we had a very strong need for the pipeline to be defined as code. Like when we talk about using GitHub to sort of keep track of things, the one missing link for a lot of people was, how do I keep track of what Jenkins is supposed to do, right? And so we created pipeline. Yes, I helped create pipeline. I had nothing to do with it. I just like to talk about it and use it. But some people like Jesse Glick, Andrew Bayer, a lot of the, I would say, titans of the Jenkins open source project
Right.
came together and built out what is today Jenkins pipeline, which is by far the best way to do things in Jenkins. I cannot, if you're using Jenkins, this camera's on. If you're using Jenkins and you're not using Jenkins pipeline, you should be using Jenkins pipeline, full stop. It's flag in the ground. It's so much better than everything that was there before. I can't stress that enough. But it's also very simple. So on the screen, what I wanted to show was like the most simple declarative pipeline.
Right. So I wanted to ask a question about that. So there are 2 different ways to define pipelines, scripted
Indeed.
versus declarative. So like, why would I use one over the other?
So there's a little bit of cultural tension in the Jenkins project. On the one side, you have people who are like, I want super awesome power tools where I can just do whatever the hell I want, whenever the hell I want.
Yeah.
That's what scripted pipeline is really for. Scripted pipeline is a subset of Groovy, which is a Java-based or JVM-based scripting language, and you can do just about anything. It's all sorts of banana stuff going on in scripted pipeline. The other part of the Jenkins project, and this is where some of the tension comes in, it's like, I don't want to think. Don't make me think about stuff I don't need to think about. How can I do this as easily and as quickly as possible?
Yeah, that's me.
That is you.
Yeah.
So declarative pipeline is the pipeline for you. But they're both actually built on top of the same sort of underlying engine.
Okay.
So it's just sort of 2 ways to get into the same underlying core of stuff, right? And so what I have on the screen, this is actually a declarative pipeline.
Okay.
And so it's very, very simple, very basic. And there's not a lot of need for you to understand how Jenkins does everything. It should be fairly straightforward to understand, fairly straightforward for everybody in the project. So maybe you've got designers, you've got some coders, a product manager, some other ops people running around. Everybody should be able to understand that Jenkins file that gets checked into your repository because you're all collaborating on that software delivery process.
Right.
So if we look at this one in particular, it's pretty basic. I mean, instead of having build, test, deploy, I'm really just doing a build. And all it is saying, give me a Docker image that runs Maven, and then run the Maven.
So my eye went right to Docker. How long have you guys been running Docker in production?
So the Docker and Jenkins have sort of an interesting past. We started using Docker for our infrastructure probably 4 years ago because Kosuke said we should do this thing, and sometimes I have to make that leap of faith when Kosuke says something. And it turns out he was right. It was good for a number of reasons. But as the Jenkins...
You heard him. He said you were right.
Kosuke probably hears enough from me that he's wrong, so it's good to have on the record that he was right. But so we started using Docker a long, long time ago within the project itself. And when we started to develop pipeline, it became very clear that Docker as a sort of build and test execution environment was an ideal sort of thing to marry into Jenkins pipeline.
Right.
Because if you think about it, like most projects now, I would say if you start a project now, you've probably got some front-end stuff in Node.js, you probably got some back-end stuff in Python or Java or whatever, Go even. I hear people use Go a lot.
Yeah.
Some people out in the fringes use Go. Everybody else uses Java.
Getting off my bum, going home.
Shit, I'll have to do the rest myself. But you have these repositories and these applications that are being developed where it's not just one environment anymore. You've got multiple languages coming together. And that's where Docker and Jenkins start to really play well together. Because in your pipeline, like what we've got here, for my build of this application, I need Java. I need the JDK. I need to build that. For another stage of this pipeline, I might need Node.js. And instead of setting up my Jenkins environment to have versions of Java installed, versions of Node.js, and managing all of that complexity, instead what I can say is just use Docker and push that to the team that runs that application, and they can choose what the right things are for their application.
Very cool.
Which is one of the things that also makes pipeline something, whichever camera's on, something you should use like right now. Whether or not you deploy Docker into production, I think that's an important lifestyle choice. You should consult your operations team on whether that's a good fit for you. For us, it's definitely made life easier, but it's not for everybody. But inside of Jenkins, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. So if I could just jump over to like an even more sort of complex Jenkins pipeline. Imagine for a second you've got your sort of simple, I've got my pipeline that does some build stuff.
Right.
The nice thing about this being code is you can start to iterate on that, and you check all of your changes into code, or into the repository. So over time, you might find, I've now got some Node.js stuff in here. I'm going to add a stage to do Node.js, and that can be another revision. Or you might find, like this is a demo one of the guys that works on this Blue Ocean project, which I'll show you in a second, created. You might find you need to do a little bit more complex things like run browser tests in parallel branches for Firefox, Safari, Chrome, etc. That you can all start to code into your Jenkins file and do something really interesting with that. So I think what I would like to do is actually show you some of the Azure stuff that we've got going, and the Blue Ocean stuff that we've got going. James Dumais, who's one of the folks that works on Blue Ocean, he really, really enjoys the color blue. So we try to give him as much grief as often as possible about his color choices, but he hasn't quite latched on to Azure yet. We've used all the other colors in the palette except for Azure. So because we're an open source project, all of our infrastructure and our code, our Jenkins files, our Terraform, our Puppet, the Java code, front-end code, all of that is open source on GitHub. But because we are the Jenkins project, we also use Jenkins very heavily to run our own infrastructure.
As one does, yeah.
As one does. I mean, if you're gonna Jenkins hard, right? So this is our actual live Jenkins instance. If you go to CI Jenkins.io, you can witness all of the crazy shenanigans that the Jenkins project has running at once. But But we actually, so I'll show you some of the stuff that we've got going on, like our Terraform pipeline. And this interface, this is Blue Ocean. And this is one of those sort of big jumps for the Jenkins project.
Right.
Where all of a sudden, Jenkins doesn't look like it was developed in 2006. It looks like some really thoughtful people came together and built something really, really great. And that's what Blue Ocean is. And it's just installed right next to the rest of Jenkins. So if I go, not .o, .io, very important, and not there either. Autocomplete. Like, this is the traditional Jenkins interface that everybody's sort of familiar with. Blue Ocean just sits right next to that and gives you this wonderful, easy-to-use user experience. So I'm going to go ahead and run some of our Terraform stuff. Big fans of Terraform. I'm really looking forward to hearing Nick talk about some Terraform stuff that HashiCorp's been doing lately. But this is just going to start running, and the beautiful thing about pipeline is if I go to some of the previous runs, you can start to see how the modeling of your continuous delivery process gets very, very, I would say, beautifully visualized and understandable for everybody in that team. So it's not just about putting the Jenkins file into source code. It's got to be understandable what's running when it's actually running inside of Jenkins.
Right.
And so in this example, in our Terraform code, we have a fairly linear pipeline. It's fairly straightforward, but we have some skipped stages here, actually. We don't need to prepare every time. We plan, which is a very useful part of Terraform, where in our case, we do a whole bunch of stuff. We sort of prepare everything, and then there's a review and an apply.
Right.
And so review is skipped here.
Yeah, explain like I'm 5.
So for us, our pipeline needs to behave differently for a pull request than for production. So we want to test our infrastructure as code as often as possible. And when someone submits a pull request, we also want to be testing that.
Right.
And the nice thing about Terraform and defining some of our infrastructure as code is for a pull request, because we're just kicking out to Azure, and we can just say, give me new infrastructure in Azure, and try to provision it from scratch with Terraform. And so we'll create a whole cluster in Azure, make sure that we can run all of our configuration, and then if this goes green, if apply goes green, then everything's good.
Got you.
For production, we actually want to review. And that's not something that, there's some, I would say, zealots for what continuous delivery or continuous deployment are. For production infrastructure, especially when you're talking about a big project like Jenkins, I really feel strongly that someone should make the final call that, hey, this isn't a stupid idea, or you're not about to just delete everything that exists in Azure, because that would be most unfortunate. So what we do is we actually just skip that in this environment. So let me jump over to our production deployment environment. Another Jenkins instance off the public internet. It's got all the good stuff there. This actually just runs the deployment part of our infrastructure. And so where we had review was missing before, in this environment, we've scripted our pipeline such that we say, if we're in this special environment, if we've got these special environment variables, that means we're actually trying to do a production deployment. And what has happened on that review stage is we waited for somebody to actually click a button. And so I can go back and see that this was deployed by Olivier. And if I get this running, do a production deployment while on camera.
Please fail, I'm just kidding.
Please do not fail. But what's really cool about this is I can watch this, I can merge changes through the normal pull request flow, get those pretty well tested for dynamically deployed infrastructure. And then when it comes time for us to deploy production, we can watch Blue Ocean, see when things come out and plan, and with Terraform it's saying, are you sure you want to do this? And then someone has to say, hell yeah, I'm sure I want to do this. Let's do it live. And then that actually goes and applies that infrastructure into Azure.
So 2017.
Yeah, it's very modern. I'm very pleased with this, actually. It took Olivier and I about a week to sort of finally find the workflow that we wanted to make work, because the Jenkins project wasn't always on Azure.
Right.
We used to live in 4 different data centers with different APIs.
Wow.
And then we partnered with Microsoft, who gave us a whole bunch of Azure and said, it's a cloud, go crazy.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And what that forced us to do is, all of a sudden, all of our infrastructure was an API away.
Right.
And so we sort of stepped back from the way that we were doing things before and said, if we were going to automate everything from the very beginning of our infrastructure, so creating a virtual machine, creating a load balancer, all the way to provisioning an application, how are we going to actually model that?
Right.
Fortunately, it was 2016, and Jenkins Pipeline existed, and Blue Ocean existed, and Terraform existed, Kubernetes existed. Like, all the right tools were there at the same time to where you could just make the easy choice and just bring them together, which is really cool.
That is cool. Good choice. Good choice, sir.
So this is not failing, but we're waiting for Docker Hub to pull some stuff. So let's just assume that's going to complete at some point in the future. Let's see where my other stuff is going. Looks like this is also waiting for infrastructure. One of the things that has been really interesting about running our Jenkins infrastructure is we started to open up the Jenkins infrastructure to more plugin developers.
Right.
So there's over 1,000 different plugins, and so we run a Jenkins environment for over 1,000 different repositories on GitHub. And
oh, snap.
It's for you, Seth. So what makes that really challenging is we've got to dynamically and elastically allocate resources for that environment, and developers are very impatient, myself included.
You don't say. Yeah.
One of the reasons I originally harshed on Java was it would take me like 60 seconds to run my unit tests. I'm like, I can't wait for the JVM to spin up.
Right.
I need instant feedback right now. 21st
Right now.
century developer.
Yes.
And so being able to sort of provision stuff on the fly in Azure with the Jenkins plugins that the Azure DevOps team has developed has actually been really, really helpful to open up CI/CD for this sort of broad spectrum of Jenkins developers through our Jenkins infrastructure, which is pretty cool. And there's a lot of cool stuff that team has done. Like yesterday, I flew up and Arun, who's the head of that team, was like, "Hey, did you see that managed Kubernetes service we launched?" I was like, "I was on the plane for 3 hours, dude. Are you serious?" Like, I left and these tools were not there, and then I land and Arun's like, "Hey, by the way, we just solved some of your problems. You should maybe check that out."
I'm just saying, Microsoft does cool things now. So like, you heard it live. We didn't edit that. I mean, it's not a voiceover. It's true.
That is true. And it's shocking. It's genuinely, like, when I started in the open source community, Microsoft was spelled with a $ for the S and all sorts of other juvenile shit like that. And now, like, all these sort of people I respect in the open source ecosystem are like, "Yeah, I work at Microsoft now." I'm like, what?
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. I'm here.
I don't process
Jess
this.
is here. It's insane. Yeah. Who are we even?
It's a very different Microsoft.
It is.
And what's especially cool, I actually have this tab open already, is there's this team that's invested in Jenkins at Microsoft, which is pretty sweet. And so all of these cool things that are available on Azure, this team is developing integrations into Jenkins for.
Man, we're cool. We are.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, with your super cool hat and whatnot.
I know, yeah.
And so what's really exciting for me, because I run Jenkins for Jenkins people, is there's tools that have come out which I still haven't been able to integrate, which are going to make their lives and my life a lot easier, like the managed Kubernetes service. There's this integration for Azure container instances, which I haven't yet rolled out to production, which is really exciting. And then some of the deployment stuff is also really interesting, because the biggest challenge for a lot of people using Jenkins is that last mile sort of to production. Like, we've tested it, we've built it, we've stood it up in a QA environment. Now getting that into production safely is something that, from the Jenkins perspective, we'd like to be modeled in the pipeline, but a lot of people don't quite have the integrations there to successfully get things out to production.
Right.
And so the Azure integration with Jenkins is actually pretty promising for that too, which is exciting.
We have about 3 minutes, so I want to make sure that we cover all of the things that you want to cover, man. So like...
There are so many things.
I know.
So of all the things that we could cover, so one of the reasons I wanted to come talk about some of the infrastructure that we have for Azure not just the plugins, which are all open source, not just Jenkins itself, which is all open source, but our infrastructure is open source. And so the way in which we use Jenkins is open source and can be copied and emulated. It's all MIT licensed. It can be pilfered at will. But like we have, in this repository, all of our stuff is under Jenkins-infra. We have our Terraform plans. And so the way that we provision infrastructure on Azure with Terraform is open for the viewing, which is simultaneously really cool, but also terrifying.
Yeah, go break some shit, y'all. It's going to be cool.
Do not go break some shit. Please. Well, so the nice thing about working on an open source project is you have to think about that,
right.
And that's why our pipeline doesn't do some things. And when we were working on pipeline very, very early within the project, there's some access controls and other useful things that will prevent, Joe Rando coming in on GitHub and submitting a pull request.
Or Ashley McNamara, who can say?
Submitting a pull request that just deletes everything. Like, the nice thing about some of the underlying features in pipeline is unless you have write access to that repository, you literally cannot. But that's not enough. Like, defense in depth is very important. Right. So we actually run multiple Jenkins environments, and Joe Rando has no access whatsoever to what actually touches production.
Perfect. Classic Joe,
Joe Rando, he's always causing trouble.
Always.
So this is still running. We're applying some stuff. That's good. Our deploy is still going. We're waiting. Docker Hub, you are killing me.
Oh, man.
Killing me.
Man.
But one of the other things that's really exciting about this for me is there's open source communities that are now sort of springing up for infrastructure stuff.
Yes.
So it's not just the people that work on Terraform, it's the people at like the Wikimedia Foundation or Media Week, I don't remember what it is. They have open sourced a lot of their infrastructure. And there's a lot of other organizations that have open sourced their infrastructure, which is really, really exciting. So I just wanted to mention this really briefly. On opensourceinfra.org, there's a fledgling group of people that are collecting links to all of the different open source infrastructure projects. And so if you don't like what the Jenkins project is doing on Azure, or you're curious about how another project deploys onto AWS or Google Cloud, all of that stuff is becoming increasingly open sourced and sort of cross-referenced, and we're sort of stealing ideas from each other on how to support open source projects in a better way, using infrastructure as code, pipeline as code.
Sure.
The X as codes, the various ones that we have available to us now. So all of this stuff is now another way that Joe Random, Ashley McNamara can come contribute to the Jenkins project, for example.
Very cool. And so we are out of time. If people want to get in touch with you and learn more about this, how would they do that?
So the best place to really go is the Jenkins.io website.
Sure.
On Jenkins.io/participate, we have a full listing of the relevant mailing lists, the IRC channels. If you wish to contact me directly and tell me all of the terrible things about my infrastructure, Tyler@linux.com.
Perfect. And then somebody asked how they could get this sweet hat. I don't know, man. I think it's exclusive.
From your cold, dead fingers is what I heard before, right?
I will fight you, Seth.
So every year at Jenkins World, which we hosted at the end of August in San Francisco, and I think it's September 2018 in San Francisco again, next year, we have a contributor summit.
I love those.
And the contributor summit is basically where we convince CloudBees and the other conference sponsors to basically set up a big room with all the AV, food, and everything that we need, and have about 50 or 60 people talk about the future of Jenkins, what we can do better, where we're having troubles, and things like that. And this year, that hat was given to Jenkins contributors. So contributing to the Jenkins project.
Contribute or steal it.
Or steal it from me when I come to Redmond.
Yeah.
That's one option.
So thank you, Tyler. It's been very cool. We're going to go over to Seth now, who still doesn't know things.
That's right. Well, let's give him a hand first, because we want the studio audience to feel like they're doing something.